Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us for today's webinar, our second session in the series of Planning for the Organizational Impact of Decarbonization. My name is Candace Preston, and I am the moderator for today's session. On behalf of ALULA and the Oil and Gas IQ team, we thank you for joining us today. This session will be presented by Krystyna Riley, Managing Director of Strategic Accounts Leader at ALULA, and her presentation promises to be well worth a listen. Before we get started, here are some quick administrative points. During the webinar, if you have any questions for our presenter, please submit them in the Q&A box on your screen, and these will be answered during the question portion of the webinar. Likewise, where there are any technical issues, please write them into the Q&A section, and our team will get to them right away. You'll notice the widgets on your screen can be resized as well as dragged around for your viewing preference, and I encourage you to visit the Resource Center on your screen for additional content and links that we and our sponsor have provided for you. So make sure you're sitting comfortably, and I'm going to hand it over to Krystyna so we can begin.
Thanks so much, Candace. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Like Candace said, I am Krystyna Riley with ALULA. I have been working with oil and gas companies and energy companies for over a decade, supporting transformations of all sizes, all kinds of complexities. So I'm really happy to be here with you today, talking about how to assess your company's cultural preparedness for your own decarbonization journey. Lucky for you all, this is my very first webinar, so just please bear with me as I have to talk to myself for 30 minutes. It's one of my worst nightmares. Not really, but in all seriousness, I do much prefer engagement and dialogue, and so in the absence of that, if you do have any questions along the way, any thoughts, just please feel free to put those in the Q&A box, and I will either get to them in the moment if I see them pop up, or of course at the end of the session today. So what are we going to talk about in our time together today? First, we'll talk about culture. So what it is, how it's developed, how it's changed over time. And then we'll get into defining your own culture. You know, how do you put it, culture, you know, the things you see and hear around you in the workplace, into words. After we talk through how to define your culture, we'll talk about how to best work within it as it exists today. And then lastly, we'll round out our 30-minute monologue with some tips on how to focus your own efforts around your own cultural preparedness for decarbonization. And I'll share a tool with you to hopefully, help you along your journey. But before we jump in, I do want to introduce you to a client situation. So I'm currently working with a US-based oil and gas company. I've worked with them for years, just on various initiatives. And over the last couple years, they, like many, have decided that they needed to improve their performance in the lower carbon space. So really they wanted to get traction going, improve progress on their plans. So a couple of years ago, they really were intentional about communicating. They communicated a lot about their goals, about their plans, expectations in the lower carbon space, what their targets are, things like that. The leadership team would tell people what to do. They'd make all these plans. They created their roadmap. They shared it. They posted it on the virtual wall, if you will, and communicated around it a lot. But nothing was changing. Nothing was happening. Performance wasn't improving. They weren't getting the traction that they were hoping for. People were still focused on the same things that they had been focused on, running the day-to-day business. And I'm sure you can all relate, in today's environment, it's hard to focus on anything but that sometimes. So the leadership team, they realized that there might be aspects of their culture that really weren't supporting the new direction that they wanted to take, the new, expectations that they were setting for people. So they took a step back to really try to figure out, why things weren't working. And they ended up doing many of the things that we'll talk about today together. So I'll come back to the story. Don't worry. I'm sure you're sitting on the edge of your seat to see what happens, but we'll come back to it at the end of the talk today. So let's get into it. Culture. Culture is a word that is thrown around a lot, particularly in organizations. So what do we mean when we say culture? We define culture as a pattern of behaviors, so what people do and say consistently that have been reinforced or punished over time. So, behaviors have been encouraged or they've been discouraged from happening. And this is either by processes, by people, systems, technology, and so on. So our behaviors in the workplace, they're shaped by what's going on around us, right? By the people that I'm around, what they find acceptable or not acceptable, by the tools that I have to work with, the technology that can either enable me or hinder my performance, the environment that I'm working within, the systems, processes that I have to work within. So all of these things happening to me, around me, those are shaping my behavior over time, shaping your behavior over time, everyone in the organization's behavior over time. And in the end, the outcome of that is your workplace culture. So that culture, that outcome, it wasn't created overnight, and it can't change overnight. It takes a long time to create culture and a long time to change it. Because again, it's those patterns of behavior, right? It's not like something happening one time that doesn't change a culture. So, unfortunately, behaviors can't change overnight either, even though I know sometimes we probably wish that they would. All right, 5 minutes in, and I already need a break from talking at you. I would really love to hear from you. So think about the culture in your current organization. What comes to mind? How would you describe it? There are a lot of labels on this list, on this poll question that we put up here for you. You'll notice some positive, some potentially not so positive cultural attributes. So pick all of the ones that stick out to you as things that you see in your own organization. I guess that you'll find that more than one of these options fits. In fact, you may have a few of the positives and a few of the not so greats. So I'm not going to read all the options to you. You guys can see those on your screen. But, it could be possible that you work in an environment where you have a really high level of trust. You're very results oriented, but you could also be risk averse and overworked or burned out. So there are lots of different options. You may need to scroll down to be able to see them all. But take a moment, pick all of the attributes that you think apply to your current culture. I'll give folks a minute to read through them and make their selections. I see some folks are responding. I'll give people a little more time. Okay, let's see what you guys said. Oh, great. So we've got a lot of collaboration and teamwork, trust and integrity, results oriented, some risk averse, conflict averse, unclear, unfocused, overworked. Yeah, so these are things that are really common across a lot of organizations. So I imagine just by the results that at least some of you picked multiple options. So you can see a lot of different things can be going on in an organization at any given time, and that outcome, that culture, has been shaped over time. But here's the thing. What we're doing right now is just labeling cultures, right? And those labels make us think either positive or negative things. When in reality, that same label could actually be both or either, right? It could be positive or negative, depending on who you're asking. But the thing with the labels is you don't always know everything behind them or the impact they're having. So if I were able to have some dialogue and interaction, here is where I would ask you, what kind of culture do you think this cartoon is depicting? What label would you put to this? Instead, I just get to tell you what I think. On the surface, I might label this scenario as a nice culture. You see somebody telling his or her colleague, great job, maybe after a presentation, a meeting, something like that. Seems nice, right? Positive. But the problem is this person is really thinking, oh man, that was a train wreck. So what could be labeled as a nice culture could ultimately be too nice of a culture, depending on your perspective. So, the being nice could be happening at the expense of developing talent or providing feedback or performing highly or performing well. So what's happening on the surface might not be totally enough to diagnose the true culture. Here, next cartoon, I might label this a compliance culture. So people doing just enough to get by. Someone's in charge, almost like a puppeteer, holding on to folks who are just wanting to get out, just waiting for the clock to hit 5 p.m. so that they can go home. What this also might look like, though, is work being turned in on time, people following rules, doing exactly what they're being asked to do. A compliance culture could be portrayed as a positive thing or a constructive thing, depending on who you ask and who's working within it. Any guesses on this next culture? What's that? Command and control? Yep, I think that's a good one. I would think so too. So you have a boss, they're shouting out directions, do it this way, do this, by this time. No, you can't do that. Yes, you can do this. Now for this type of culture, for some, it could be very demotivating, right? Being told what to do all the time. No leeway, no creativity. But for others, they might like the very clear direction and guardrails that they've been given. The impact of this type of culture, again, could be very different for different people. And lastly, I've come across this type of culture many times. It's just chaotic, right? Just in time, things all over the place, priorities all over the place, in the moment firefighting. And some people thrive in this type of an atmosphere. They love being busy bees, right? Having too much to do. Some people feel most productive amidst chaos, while others just can't seem to keep their heads above water, looking around them thinking, I cannot keep up with this. This is not sustainable. I can't deal with this. So the moral of the story, or the cartoons, if you will, is that labels, while they may seem initially helpful to describe your respective cultures, they don't always tell the full story. So what you need to do is start out by figuring, what do you see and hear consistently? So those patterns of behavior that we talked about that lead to the outcome that is your culture. And then what's the impact of it, right? Because that way you'll know if those patterns of behavior, that culture is ultimately having a positive effect or not. So if you see a lot of people getting, good jobs or great jobs, amazing jobs, but performance is poor, that nice culture might be something that you actually need to figure out how to work within and address. Really, it is easier to work within your current culture than it is to embark on creating a new culture during a time of transformation or in transition, such as what we're facing with decarbonization. Again, culture doesn't change overnight. And ultimately, if you truly want to change your culture, just wholesale change it, you'd be embarking on two transformations. So culture change and decarbonization. And that can be pretty daunting and difficult. So at least starting out, just assessing your current culture so you can understand the positive aspects, really understand how to leverage those, how to use those to your advantage, and then any areas of opportunity, how to either work within them, just you need to at least know what's going on to be able to work within the current situation, or how to mitigate them, how to address parts of the opportunities that you're seeing over time. And that will ultimately set you up for success, and you'll be, well on your way to having a high performing culture to support your decarbonization journey. So when I say decarbonization and high performing culture, what do I mean? At ALULA, we've done years of extensive research with companies to understand what is a high performance culture? What does it really consist of? And we've identified 4 cornerstones of a high performance, sustainable culture: direction, competence, opportunity, and motivation, or DCOM. So DCOM is a frame or tool that is used to evaluate and transform organizations to high performance. So I won't go into all the details of the research behind how we came up with this framework, the organizations that we worked with. But if you are interested in learning more, we do have a white paper in the Resource Center that you should feel free to download. It has a ton of great information, a lot more detail than we'll go into today. So DCOM, it is much like a 4-cylinder engine. So if all 4 components are firing properly, you'll have a high-performing culture or vehicle. But if any cylinder is firing poorly, or any combination of cylinders, you'll get the results that are shown here. And you'll likely have some kind of potential action that you might want to take to help mitigate those cultural opportunities and those results. So first, we have D in DCOM, direction. Does everybody in your organization clearly understand what is most important for the mission at hand? So your decarbonization journey. And not only just, the mission, but what's their specific role in it? What are they supposed to do? How does the work that they do contribute to that mission? So if not, you'll likely have confusion, potentially inaction, maybe chaos. You might see people working really hard, but not making progress on what you're expecting. You could see something similar to the Busy Bees cartoon that we looked at just a minute ago. Or, they could be so confused that they're not working on much at all because they don't want to waste their time working on something that is pointless. If they feel like direction isn't clear, if direction is changing all the time, a lot of times people will just not work as hard. Next up, we have competence. So do people have the capability to achieve the vision that you've set out? So when I say competence and capability, I don't only mean technical skills. A lot of times we just go directly to, are they technically capable to do their jobs? Competence also needs to be around leadership skills, collaboration, economic and business literacy and acumen, work management skills like decision-making, problem-solving, like all those kinds of things. So competence in all areas of work to enable you to achieve your vision. And if people, don't have that required competence, the result is often, high risk, poor performance. Sometimes it's ultimately, to the detriment of long-term, success and financial viability. So the next important cornerstone or cylinder is opportunity. So do people have the resources, the time, the tools that they need to be successful, to achieve the vision of lower carbon? And are barriers that they're coming up against, are they removed? Are they managed? All too often employees, they're really willing to put in the extra effort, the extra time needed to work through difficult periods, to work through times of change, transformations, but they may actually be prevented from performing their best because the organization isn't giving them the opportunity they need to be successful. So things like lack of authority, lack of decision rights, too strict boundaries, not being able to be creative, make a quick decision in the moment, restrictive work processes. all these types of things can eventually lead to a frustrated workforce and culture. So rounding out the engine is motivation. So do people want to perform, or do they just feel like they have to perform? High performing cultures with really high motivation are especially good at creating environments where, people feel good about doing a good job. They provide frequent positive and constructive feedback on how folks are doing, and they make sure that people know that their efforts and contributions are truly appreciated. Doing that well, that creates what we call discretionary performance. So people going above and beyond. However, if it's not happening, if motivation is low, folks will become indifferent and not put in any extra effort. You'll see disengagement, you'll see low morale. You'll likely see that cartoon with folks lining up to leave work right before quitting time, just doing the bare minimum. In the worst cases, you'll see attrition, right? You'll see people leaving your company. And unfortunately, research has told us that fewer than 15% of managers actually create a motivating work environment. Most organizations have a huge opportunity in this motivation space. And it's hard, right? It's much harder to create an atmosphere where you're motivating your employees than it is to set direction, let's say. So that this motivation column's a tough one. So understanding where your company falls in the decom space is really helpful in assessing your current culture and then enabling you to work within it. Just really understanding, what you're doing well, where you may need to take some actions to mitigate any gaps. So let's take a moment to reflect. Think about your organization. Think about the 4 decom components. Which do you feel your company currently does best? So out of the 4, which one are you best at? Do you think your employees at your company have good direction? Do folks have the competence they need to be able to achieve your lower carbon goals? Do they have the opportunity to do so? Or are they really motivated to support you in your decarbonization journey? So I'll give a moment for folks to submit their responses. Just think through which one you do best. I see some answers coming in. I'll give another minute. All right. Let's see what folks came up with. Oh, wow. Might be the first time I've seen 100% on a poll. So everyone who answered believes that what you do best in your organization is having the competence to fulfill people's role in supporting decarb. That's really great, right? Like that is, people need to know, how to do what they're supposed to be doing. So perfect. All right, so on the flip side, think about, where you and your company may have the most opportunity to work on in decom. So, and this isn't a bad thing, right? Like all organizations can improve in certain areas. It just gives you a little bit more clarity on, where you might want to focus your efforts. It helps ensure that you're not missing anything as you're on your lower carbon journey. So I'll give a minute to, again, think through the decom elements, direction, competence, opportunity, and motivation, where do you think your culture could improve upon the most? See if it's 100% again with the same response. One more minute. Is this silence as awkward for you as it is for me? Okay, almost. So 75% say there's an opportunity around direction, and then 25% around opportunity. So it's good to know that, right? And particularly around the direction side, we see this a lot with companies right now in the decarbonization space, because it's a tough thing to wrap your head around. It's a tough thing to know, what exactly to do, what to prioritize. It's such a long journey with so many different steps to get there. It's hard to really be clear about next steps, priorities, and then be able to provide that direction. And then, of course, around the opportunity, there can be a lot of different barriers standing in the way, and how to mitigate those. It's just something to think about. Okay. So I want to take you back to the case example that I shared at the beginning, just of the client that I'm working with. So if you recall, they're a US-based oil and gas company, originally just trying to improve their traction around their decarbonization plans. Spent a lot of time setting expectations, communicating, telling people to do things differently. Nothing was changing. So they decided to take a step back, figure out, what was going on, why things weren't working, why things weren't moving forward. And they decided to use our DCOM framework to really help them assess the cultural situation. So they decided to conduct quarterly pulse checks using a DCOM survey with the whole organization. So they sent these surveys out, once a quarter, around a handful of DCOM questions. So it wasn't overwhelming, but there were questions in each of the 4 categories, really to understand, again, where are they doing well, and where do they have opportunities? Where might they need to take action? What could be holding them back? They were able to break out their results, by business unit, by function, even by leader, if the leader had enough direct reports answering the survey so that it would be anonymous. So their senior leadership team reviewed those results of the pulse checks every time, every quarter. But then the most important thing was, and you can guess it, they took action, right? They took action with the results. So, the worst thing you can do is continuously survey your company, try to get feedback on what's going on, and then not do anything with it. Like, people are going to get frustrated. They're going to stop responding to your survey. So this leadership team, they took some actions. Not everything all at once, right? But they prioritized where they had the most room to grow. They prioritized their actions. They only picked a critical few, and then they paced out those opportunities. Because again, remember, it's easier, when embarking on a transformation such as decarbonization, it's easier to, work within your culture, make tweaks along the way, rather than wholesale try to fix everything and change your culture overnight. So what happened? Here are the results after their first year of doing the quarterly DCOM pulse survey. So you can see here, the percentage of agree or strongly agree responses. And down here you can see the color of the quarters. So you can see that overall, improvement quarter after quarter. Not in each and every question. You'll see some questions slipped one quarter, some kind of stayed the same, but on the whole, improvement over the year, particularly in that 4th survey, the 4th quarter. Because again, culture isn't going to change overnight. So another thing that this leadership team did really well was just understand, I can't go change something today. I can't go take an action and then tomorrow the result is going to be there. It's going to take time. Don't get discouraged. And so, they picked their few priorities, and at first it was mainly around that motivation piece. You can see that their scores around motivation were, lower. So the questions are in order of decom. And then, they just took it pace by pace, piece by piece to focus their efforts. And at the same time, they were also measuring progress on their decarbonization journey and on their plans. And so guess what? After they started to see some of these cultural improvements, they also started to see performance improvements, progress toward their roadmap. Guess the best part of all of this, you all can do this too. So I'd like to leave you today with the ability to do your own organizational culture, decom assessment. So you can see, where you think you're doing well, where you might have opportunities. You can also have other people in your organization take the assessment so you can see if you agree or not, see where you might have differences in how you see your own culture, where you have room to grow. So you can just scan the QR code that's on your screen to access this diagnostic tool. When you do that, a web page, a browser will pop up. It'll have instructions for how to complete the survey. And then once you complete it, we will immediately email you your results. And then after that, either myself or my colleague, John Dale, who you may have had the pleasure of hearing his webinar a few weeks ago. It was the first webinar in this series. We'll reach out to you, just giving you some personalized thoughts on actions that you might want to take based on your own results. We deal with organizations every day who have, either one or multiple pieces of this decom elements missing. And depending on what's missing and depending on what's in place, you have to take different actions to be successful. So we are more than happy to share our thoughts with you around that. Would love to help you on your journey around, your cultural preparedness for decarbonization. So with that, I would like to wrap up my monologue and open it up for any questions or thoughts that you may have. Please feel free to put them in the question and answer box, and I'll turn it over to Candace to, go over the questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Krystyna. Great presentation. And we have some questions that have been coming in from our audience. So yeah, if you see it on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there will be the Q&A box to submit your questions. And I'll go through the first question here. Krystyna, what would you say, whose responsibility is culture?
Oh, that is a great question. It's your responsibility. No, it is truly, it's everybody's responsibility. I mean, certainly it would be easy to just say it's the leadership team's responsibility to impact culture. And very much that's true. I mean, what leaders do and say day in and day out absolutely impact culture. But I am of the opinion that every person in an organization ultimately is responsible for how they show up, how they interact, and can impact the culture using their own behaviors and patterns of behavior over time. So I think everyone is.
Awesome. Okay, our next question here is, how do you get people to do new things if your culture is risk adverse and the old way of doing things is more comfortable?
Yeah, so a few thoughts here. Risk aversion can be tough to deal with, particularly depending on what we're talking about. If we're talking, safety, if we're talking financial risk, I mean, I think there's a whole realm of different options. But the first thing you can do is give permission, right? Set the direction, set the expectations that it is okay to take risks. Maybe give some parameters, some examples of what you mean by risk taking, so that people know, what kind of leeway am I given here. And then the most important thing after you give permission to do it is what you do when people actually take risks. So if you see someone taking a risk, even if it doesn't pan out, even if they fail, reinforce them for it, thank them for it, highlight it to others as a good example of risk taking, because the thing with risk taking is it's not always going to be successful, right? And if people get punished for doing it when it's not successful, they'll be less likely to take risks in the future. So set the direction, make it okay, and then reinforce people for doing it.
Fantastic. Okay, our next question. Is there a difference between team culture and organizational culture?
Yes. So there are all types of kind of mini microcosm cultures within the broader organization culture. So, you could have a business unit culture, within that a functional culture, within that your own immediate team culture. So when you're kind of assessing your own culture's preparedness, you could do it at any of those levels, depending on where you sit in the organization, what you have impact over, and where you might have improvement. So yeah, multiple types of cultures within an organization. There could all even be geographical considerations. If you're an Asian culture versus Western, there's all kinds of different things at play when it comes to culture and those patterns of behavior.
Awesome. Our next question, we have a few more still. I'm going to push out to you is, what are the key metrics for measuring cultural change within a company?
Good question. So I think, it depends on your company and what is important to you. I would say a good start, if you do end up taking a look at that DCOM assessment, a lot of those DCOM components are great measures or indicators. Our advice would be pick some leading indicators. So things like, some level of motivation or engagement, those types of things, and then more lagging indicators, attrition, retention, and so forth. So that you are able to, make changes based on the leading indicators that you're seeing more quickly, real time, and then see how it impacts those lagging indicators that you have to wait longer to see what's happening. So take a look at the DCOM assessment. A lot of those are the indicators that we would suggest to companies to use.
Fantastic. Thanks, Krystyna. Our next question for you is, how do companies start dealing with culture at the leadership level?
They have to prioritize it. Culture is a hard one because, one, it is an outcome, so it takes a long time to change. And two, just with everything else going on day to day, the daily running of the business, the things that come up, the other priorities, it's hard to protect time for. So the first thing that, leadership teams need to do is just prioritize it, protect time for it, spend time on it, talk about it at meetings, talk about it constantly, figure out what actions you need to take and commit to, and check in on how you're doing. But you have to prioritize it or it's not going to happen.
Thanks so much. Okay, Krystyna, this is our last question that we have in, unless anyone has a last-minute question they'd like to toss in for Krystyna. And our question here is, how do I bring the topic of culture up to my leadership team so we fast-track some culture work?
Leadership teams like to see data, right? Data really need to just drive kind of their decision-making, their prioritization, all of that. And so if you see your culture excuse me, impacting, some type of result negatively, that's what you bring to them and make the case for it, right? Tell them, what you're seeing, what you're hearing, the impact of that on performance, the impact of that on people. And then, just make the case for why it needs to be a priority, how it's going to help you really fast track and accelerate your performance. Because it's all going to come down to, the business case, right? That's what leadership teams need to be able to pick what they want to prioritize.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Krystyna. I really appreciate your time, and what a great informative webinar. And thank you to everybody who's watching for taking the time to listen in today. If you'd like to listen to this webinar again, this session will be on demand shortly. And if you'd like to listen to part 1 of our 3-part series, you can click on the link on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to watch that now or anytime you're available. And remember to check out more of our upcoming events as well as on-demand webinars at www.oilandgasiq.com/events. Thanks again, Krystyna, and for everyone watching, have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.